All of the VR effects in After Effects can be found under the immersive video category, and these are designed specifically to work with 360 VR source material. So whether that's a 360 image or a 360 video clip. I have a 360 video clip here that I got from Envato Elements, so I'm just gonna click and drag that to a new composition and show you that this is a 4K video that was shot on a 360 camera with multiple lenses and stitched together, and it looks really weird in this raw format. It's called equirectangular footage, and we're able to see 360 degrees around this entire footage of this yacht moving through the water. And that's great, but I want to be able to see this in a format that's much more like how you're actually going to be viewing it, whether it's on a phone where you're panning around the footage using your finger, or on YouTube where you can click and drag to pan, or even a VR headset. Regardless, that's how I want to be looking at it inside of After Effects. And if we go up to Window and then all the way down at the bottom, it's actually off the screen from my recording right now, but there's a script file at the very bottom called VR Comp Editor. And if you click on that, it's gonna bring up this little panel. And it has two very simple buttons, add a 2D edit and add a 3D edit. And this is talking about 2D or 3D footage. This is not stereoscopic footage. It's not meant to be viewed in 3D. It's a 360-degree video clip, but it's a 2D image. This will never be viewed in a 3D stereoscopic view. So I'm gonna click Add 2D Edit, and then we're gonna get this extra little panel here where you get to choose the composition that has the 3D60 footage in it. It's automatically selected this comp. And then you need to choose what you want your actual comp width to be. I want it to be 1920 by 1080, so I'll keep that at 1920 and make the aspect ratio 16 by 9. And then we have camera settings, because it's going to generate a camera for us. I'm just gonna leave it at its default of using a 2-node camera and click Add 2D Edit. Now I can close this little comp editor, and what has happened is I have a folder in my project panel that has a couple of different comps in it, as well as another folder with 2 more comps in it. And it's opened up the comp with VR2 Edit 1 in the title. And if we take a look at the actual comp, this is now a 1920 by 1080 comp, and if I switch to my camera controls, specifically the orbit tool, I can click and drag and view this just like it would be in a YouTube video player. Which is great. Now I can view this much more similarly to the way that it's actually going to be viewed once it's exported. All right, let me recenter that camera up and then walk through a little bit more of what happened. If I double click into this comp, we're gonna have 2 locked layers. One's a camera and one's a pre-comp, just like before. But the difference between these 2 comps is that this one has a VR sphere to plane effect applied, which is what's converting that spherical footage into this 2D image that I'm able to pan around in. And it's basically making a 3D environment sphere out of that footage. So that's what the VR sphere to plane effect does. Now you don't really ever have to touch this if you use the VR comp editor script, which is why these 2 were locked. It already did everything we needed it to. But I wanna go into that pre-comp because this is our original source comp. When I dragged this footage into the new comp button, it made this pre-comp. And that's what's plugged into this VR sphere to plane right here. So let me lock that up again, and then take a look at the names of these comps one more time. We have VR2 output, which has a VR converter applied, and this is another one of the immersive video effects. But the input and output are both set to equirectangular 2:1, because the input is in that format and the output is going to end up in that format as well. If you were converting from a different source type or you needed it to end up in a different source type, you could modify these to whatever you need. Now, I don't have that much experience with VR footage, but if you're dealing with it, it's likely that you know what you need and which one of these settings you should be checking. And depending on which output you have set, you might have field of view options here. The output frame width is defaulted to what the source footage was set to. That's what I want it to be. And then we have reorient camera view, which allows us to rotate this footage around, basically setting the orientation of the initial camera if you wanted the default view to be at a different position. So if I wanted it to be looking at the front of the ship, then I could point it this way rather than having it pointing towards the back. So if I was going to add effects and insert things into this scene, this is the comp that I'm going to render from, the output comp. But let's back out of that one and take a look at these other few. I'm gonna close this one too and just look at the project view. Since these names are so long, it's a little hard to see, but there's our output comp and here's our edit comp. So let's go into that edit comp and see what we can do here. Since I have a 3D camera, I could type out some VR text, make it 3D, and then back this up a little bit, maybe raise it up and move my camera around, and it looks like that text is in the scene now. So this is a 3D environment that I can place 3D effects in. But these VR effects actually aren't going to be applied in this comp. Because remember, this is basically just a preview of the final VR footage. And these effects are designed to work with the actual 360 video before it's been converted. So I'm gonna go all the way back into this source comp and then make a new adjustment layer by going up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And I'll just call this Effects. And we'll just go down the line here. The first effect is VR Blur. If I double click that, it'll bring the effect out. And basically all of these VR effects are going to have a few of the same options. The first is frame layout, which you can change depending on the type of footage that you're working with. This is, again, monoscopic 2D. We're not dealing with stereoscopic footage, but if you are, you can change this to over, under, or side by side so that it applies the effect properly. We have horizontal field of view and vertical field of view. If you're working with 360 footage, leave this alone. If you're working with 180 footage, so 180 degrees, change this first one down to 180. I don't need to do that, so I'm gonna undo. And then finally, we have the blurriness control. So if I turn this up, it's just like a normal blur. But there is a difference between this and any other standard blur. So if, as I'm doing this, you pay attention to the lower and upper parts of the frame, it's a little hard to tell, but they're blurring out more towards those edges. And this is because it's accounting for distortion that comes from shooting and stitching together 360 footage. So what I want to do is jump back to my preview comp, which is this one right here, and then point the camera straight up. So the seam of this 360 footage is right around this point, and I'm going to take a snapshot. Then I'll jump back to this comp and turn off the VR blur, and then just grab, let's say, a fast box blur and apply that, and just crank it up a little bit and turn on repeat edge pixels. Now, if I go back to my preview comp, you can see right there that seam very clearly in all of this distortion. If I show that snapshot and then go back and forth, you can see exactly what's happening now. The whole point of these VR effects is that that distortion is compensated for, so you don't see those seams and non-uniform distortion when viewing the 360 footage. And that's true for all of the VR effects. So let me get rid of that. We're done with VR blur. Let's take a look at the next one in the list. We've got VR Chromatic Aberrations. I'll drag that out to my adjustment layer, and immediately I have chromatic aberration happening, and it's around a point of interest right here, which I can move around. It's just a point control, but this gives us that chromatic RGB split that's a lot of fun and allows us to apply that distortion to the 360 footage. So again, I'll jump back here and we can see that chromatic aberration happening around that point. If I pan around here, we don't see much of it at all. But I have individual controls for the red, green, and blue aberration. If I don't want it so intense, I could maybe set that to -5, blue to 5, and now it's less dramatic. Or I could go in the opposite direction, let's say 25 and 25, and then zoom out, and this is now very distorted, but I also have a fall off distance slider, which allows me to control that fall off to make it more or less dramatic, as well as the ability to invert that fall off. Again, all this distortion is happening in a way to compensate for that 360 footage, but that doesn't mean that you can't use it in a normal comp. So if I just jump over into this comp that I prepared real quick and I add an adjustment layer here, and I add that same chromatic aberrations effect to it, and in fact, let's go ahead and add a grid behind this so that it's nice and easy to see, I can use this chromatic aberration in a standard comp. We are going to get this distortion that's supposed to be compensating for that 3D footage, but you can play around with these settings to make that more or less visible. It would definitely be nice to have a non-VR version of this effect, since it is a single effect to create the chromatic aberration that would normally take multiple layers and multiple effects. But if you're okay with the distortions, then this is a really easy way to apply that. All right, let's jump back into the comp where we're adding the effects and take a look at the next one, which is VR color gradients. So let me get rid of the aberrations, apply the color gradients, and this is actually pretty similar to the 4 color gradient effect, except we have 8 points of color control. And again, it's compensating for that VR distortion. Now the first control we have is actually the number of points. So 8 is the maximum, but I could turn this down to any number between 1 and 8. Of course, 1 is just going to be a fill, so you're going to want to do something between 2 and 8. Next is gradient power, and this is basically how intense each one of these colors is. As I turn this down, you see how they get less saturated. And then we have gradient blend, which controls how much each gradient blends into each other. Then we have the points control, which is where we can choose colors for each one of the points, as well as the actual position of each point. So I can just click and drag these around to move them and position them wherever I want them. And I can go in here and change the colors as well. It's kind of just done a color spectrum cycle here, but I could change these to be something a little bit more uniform, or have it go along with whatever color scheme that I'm using. And then we have an opacity slider, which just dials that back, as well as a blending mode option, which gives us blend modes just like the layer styles. So I could set this to overlay, and now it's going to blend on top of that VR footage. And if I go back to my edit comp where I can preview this, I can spin the camera around and see how those color gradients are being blended on top of that VR footage. All right, next up we have the VR converter effect, which we've already taken a look at. It's not something I'd want to apply to this footage, but it allows you to choose an input source as well as an output format, as well as actually controlling the output frame width. This will resize the comp if you change the number. So if I change this to 1920, my comp has been resized and it messed everything up. So I'll undo that. And we've already looked at this reorient camera view where you can basically choose that orientation starting point. All right, next in the list is VR denoise. And this is just a simple denoising effect. If I zoom in, you can see that my colors are getting a little bit more muddy because of the way that it's reducing the noise. It's basically simplifying the image. And we just have two controls, noise type, which is random valued or salt and pepper. And these are just two different methods for removing noise. I'll undo that. And then we have noise level. So if I turn this to a lower value, it'll be a less intense noise removal. And if I turn it up, it's going to get very intense. And all of these colors are going to start to look a little bit more posterized. Next up is a fun one. It's called VR Digital Glitch. And this is basically a combination of using displacement map with this kind of blocky displacement map and chromatic aberration. And we have a lot of controls for this one. It's not animated by default, but we can go into the distortion settings and animate it. But let's just walk through all of the controls. First, we have point of interest, which is where the distortion will be starting from. By default, it's not going to do anything because my point of interest scale is set to 100. If I decrease this value, you can kind of see where that fall off is. And if I move it around now, it's much clearer what's happening. Now, this is a very hard fall off between the affected and unaffected area. So keep that in mind as you're changing the point of interest scale. But we also have the ability to change the point of interest aspect. So if I increase that, it's going to become a wider distortion. And if I turn that down to a negative number, it's going to get a lot skinnier. Let me set those back to their defaults. And then we have master amplitude. So if I turn this up or down, you can see that this is actually displacing pixels. I'll zoom in so we can see that more clearly, as well as controlling that chromatic aberration. So this is a way that you can animate the intensity of that digital glitch. Then we have the distortion section, and this has a lot of controls. So we have color distortion, which is that chromatic aberration intensity. We can turn that up or down. We have geometry distortion X, which is that displacement on the X-axis, the Y-axis, as well as the Z-axis. We can turn up or down that distortion complexity, which is basically a scale for that displacement map. And we also have a distortion rate, which is kind of like the amount of the distortion. If I turn it down, there will be less showing up. And if I turn it up, the distortion will show up in more places. We have distortion evolution, which is pretty random. You're not going to notice too much repetition when you do this, but you can cycle this all the way around as a way to animate the distortion. And we also have color evolution. If I increase this, you can see that it's basically cycling that chromatic aberration back and forth. And this is obviously much easier to notice those repetitions. Let me set that back to 0. Next up is the transform controls. And this is for the actual distortion. So if I turn the scale X down, it's going to scale everything down on that X axis. And we have Y and Z scale as well. And then we have translate X, Y, and Z, which is basically the position of that distortion. It shifts it around on the X axis, on the Y axis, or the Z axis. And even further inside this, we have subsettings, and this is the sub influence for the distortion map, as well as the sub scaling. So this is similar to the fractal noise or turbulent noise effects. Let me collapse those up. And next up is the noise section. And this is actually set to 0, so we're not seeing any. But if I zoom in nice and close, I can turn up the noise strength, and that will add noise to my image. I could lower the noise quantity, so there's not quite so much. Increase or decrease that noise scale, as well as use noise evolution to animate the noise. And then finally, we have the checkbox for color noise to enable color in that noise instead of keeping it monotone. All right, I'll turn that noise off, collapse that up. And finally, we have a random seed, which just randomizes the entire distortion across all of the controls. That's another good way to randomly animate the noise. Now, again, this effect does not only have to be used on VR footage. So if I go back to my 2D comp and apply this digital glitch to this comp, turn off that VR chromatic aberrations, this actually displays pretty uniformly. And let's say I only wanted to use the chromatic aberration. If I go into the distortion, and then just reduce the geometry distortion down to 0, as well as the distortion rate down to 0, then I'm only going to get this RGB split, and I can control it with that color distortion slider. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any way to warp that distortion. It's uniform across the entire image, but sometimes that's all you need, and this is a very simple way to be able to do that. Or let's say you didn't want the RGB split, I could turn that off and turn up my distortion rate a little bit again, turn up the X and the Y, and now I have a very simple, easy to use displacement distortion across my entire comp. So don't be afraid to use these VR effects on standard comps. All right, next up is the VR Fractal Noise. This is almost identical to the Fractal Noise effect, just compensating for that 360 distortion. You could set this to overlay, and that fractal noise is applied uniformly across the entire scene. And we have basically all the same controls as the regular fractal noise. So I could change this to maybe the strings type, change the blending mode to add a lot of contrast, maybe turn the brightness down just a little bit, turn up the complexity, go into my transform and scale it down a little bit, go into the sub settings, maybe increase that sub influence and turn the sub scaling down as well. And then keyframe this evolution over a few seconds. And now I have this animated kind of electrical looking field. Maybe I'll turn my adjustment layer off for a second, change the blending mode back to none on the effect and change the layers blend mode to add. Then I could add a tint effect to change the white color to be something that looks a little bit more like a hot energy, and then add a glow effect on top of that. Modify some of these settings to give it this nice glowy hot look, and then jump back into this comp and see how that looks. And because it's animated, I can scrub through my timeline and see how that's applied over time. Okay, let's get rid of those effects and turn my adjustment layer back on, remove that blend mode, and go back into our immersive video category. And next up is VR Glow. So I'll apply that over top of that adjustment layer, turn the threshold down so it applies to more of the image, and turn the radius of that glow up. We can control that glow brightness, as well as the glow saturation, which is a nice little slider. And we can also use a tint color. So if we don't want it to be based on the colors of the VR footage, I could change this to be something different. And now we have this bright orangey glow on top of our footage. Next up is VR plane to sphere, which again, it's not something I'd want to do on top of this footage. What it's intended for is placing 2D objects into a 3D scene. So if I were to grab my logo and just drop it out here and apply VR plane to sphere to it, it's going to apply distortion to my logo to fit the 360 footage. And if I move this layer around, you see that it doesn't make a difference where it is anymore. That's all being controlled within this effect. So my frame layout is monoscopic. The field of view is set to be this 360 footage. And from here, I could change, say, the scale if I want it to be a little bit bigger. And you see how that's distorting to fit the 360 footage. So I'll make it a little bit bigger. And then I can reposition this if I go into rotate projection and say projection pan on the y-axis. I could shift this over, maybe rotate it upwards a little bit as well. And maybe that's a little large, so I'll scale it down a bit. And then we have rotate source, which is actually going to rotate it in 3D space. So if I wanted to rotate it around to make it look like it's angled a little bit and not quite so perfectly aligned to the camera, I can do that. And now if I go back to my preview comp and rotate around to find my logo, it looks like it's in the scene. And I'll take a snapshot of that point and jump back in here, duplicate the logo and remove the effect and kind of just reposition this to be in about the same spot and turn off the unaffected version. And you can see now how distorted that is compared to this snapshot version. So that is what the VR plane to sphere effect allows you to do. Create a 2D source and then distort it to fit this 360 footage. All right, I'm gonna get rid of those. And the next option is rotate sphere. If I apply that, this allows me to just rotate that footage around within the comp. And I can do that on any axis. Again, this is basically just setting the orientation of the footage. And we can even invert the rotation. So if I make something really crazy and invert it, then it will rotate in the opposite direction. All right, I'll delete that. And the next option is VR Sharpen. And this is just a sharpness filter with one sharpen amount slider. If I turn it up really high, you see that it distorts differently at the top and edges of my comp than it does in the center of the frame. It's a very simple one. And then finally, we have sphere to plane, which we've already taken a look at. That is what has allowed us to convert our 360 footage into a format that is viewable the same way that it will be once it's exported and uploaded to YouTube or wherever this footage will be viewed. So that is a very quick run through of all of the VR effects. Don't be afraid to use them on your regular 2D comps. And obviously there's a lot more to 360 video and working with VR footage in After Effects, but Adobe has put together plenty of tutorials on how to work in this VR environment, and you can find lots of tutorials online if that's something that you need to know how to do. But that's everything you need to know about the VR effects in After Effects. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all of that stuff in the description of this video.